The virtues of temperance and fortitude are virtues because they perfect an important aspect of the human person, as temperance perfects our concupiscence and fortitude perfects our irascibility. But both of these virtues make the ones who have them better or more excellent, primarily as individuals. No discussion of morality or virtue would be complete, however, without considering what sort of moral habit perfects us not as individuals, but as members of a larger whole, as members, we might say, of a community. The virtue that does this is what Aristotle and Aquinas call justice. The virtue of justice on the Thomistic and Aristotelian worldview only makes sense on the premise that living in a community is something that is good and natural to us as human beings. And accordingly, Aristotle lays out his understanding of our communal nature at the very outset of his famous book entitled The Politics. The argument goes something like this. The most fundamental and immediate community in which human beings find themselves is the family, or as Aristotle calls it, the household. That is, a mother, a father, and one or more children. The immediate naturalness and necessity of the family is obvious because it's required both for the propagation of the human species as well as the survival and well-being of the children. Households provide food, clothing, shelter, and other necessities of life through the hard work of the parents, the children, when they're of age, and Aristotle even adds, slaves. Even the most primitive of human beings, therefore, are found in households. But as time goes on, these households usually discover that life is much more livable when households gather together. The principal motivation behind this is quite simple. It's based on the division of labor. With only families, every man must be his own house builder, his own shoemaker, hunter, farmer, blacksmith, and ditch digger. But when families gather together, each man has the ability to specialize in one job, and thus trade the fruits of his labor for the other things that his family needs. As a result, the things he builds are much better than before, when he was distracted by countless other tasks, as are the goods and services for which he trades, which are themselves produced by specialists in some other area. This conglomeration of families Aristotle calls a village, and the transition from the household to the village is a crucial development in the natural moral evolution of humanity. But this evolution does not stop with the village. As the village's usefulness becomes more apparent, villages grow larger and larger, and as they grow larger, certain problems arise. The most common problem is that in larger villages, barter and trade becomes more cumbersome and even confusing. It's inconvenient for a farmer to schlep hundreds of bags of potatoes to the other side of the village in payment for a man who builds his barn or house. Also, it has to be decided how many potatoes are worth how many houses, and how many of these are worth how many shoes, and how many shoes are worth how many feet of ditch, and so on and so forth. Of course, the solution to both of these problems is some kind of currency, and ideally coin money, which facilitates the exchange of goods immensely. With the invention of money, however, other problems are invited. For one thing, conditions are established for some people, through luck, shrewdness, and hard work, to become wealthy and to amass a great amount of money. With just barter and trade, a chicken farmer can feed his family and provide the necessities of life. But with money, he can become the chicken king of the nation. As a result, much greater economic inequality becomes possible for the first time. And with that, the conditions are set for theft, robbery, and other forms of injustice. As a result, a police force is required. And if the village as a whole becomes wealthy, an army is necessary for the protection of its inhabitants from outsiders. To be sure, this process may take a while, But eventually, these inevitable changes taking place in the growth of a village means that eventually we're not talking about a village at all anymore, but a completely different kind of community, what Aristotle calls a polis, or political community. Unlike the village, which could get by with unwritten conventions and personal agreements for mutual advantage, the polis requires laws, and political bodies to deliberate as to what the laws should be, not even to mention to enforce those laws. It's really with the advent of the polis, then, that justice is spoken of for the first time in any meaningful sense. And certainly the existence of law and the need for obedience is one major reason for this. But there's something else going on as well, on an even deeper level. Consider, for instance, the creation of an army, which is necessary for the first time once the polis begins to eclipse the village and becomes the new community to which people belong. Something profound has changed. The reason for this is that the village was what Aristotle called a partnership, that is, a cooperative venture among individuals or families for mutual advantage. The entire reason for entering and remaining in the village, in other words, was the fact that doing so served one's individual interests more than remaining on one's own. This is precisely the reason the village came into being in the first place. To suggest to a mere villager that he should make a sacrifice for the sake of the village would strike him as nonsensical. It would be like trying to persuade someone in a business partnership that he should stay in the partnership even when it was causing him to lose money. The whole point of the partnership was to serve one's interests more effectively, and so the very idea of sacrifice is just self-defeating. But obviously, this cannot be the perspective of a soldier charged with defending a polis. The soldier must be ready to make a great sacrifice for the sake of his community, even the ultimate sacrifice. And so somehow his perspective must change. In fact, it's precisely this change in perspective that constitutes the most important aspect of the transition from the village to the polis. For the first time, members of a new polis aim at something that just didn't exist in the village, namely what Aquinas later calls the common good. Moreover, the common good is something that members of the polis seek out as something larger and more worthy of their time and attention than their own individual interests. Aristotle and Aquinas both argue that what is true for the soldier is also true, or at least should also be true, for citizens. And in fact, citizens, properly understood, did not really exist in the village. Once the village transforms into a polis, however, there exists a new moral horizon, a common good that presents itself as bigger, more authoritative. Aristotle even adds more divine than the individual good. It is crucial to point out that, for Aristotle and Aquinas, this transition from the village to the polis is something that is profoundly natural for human beings. Humans, in other words, have a natural tendency to gather in polises and only truly flourish as members of polises. This is not just because polises are bigger, stronger, wealthier, better protected, or more technologically advanced than villages. It's rather that the polis, by definition, is the only community that unlocks the human person's moral capabilities. The capability to give oneself over to a community that transcends one's own self-interest. This is why Aristotle famously argues that the difference between a village and a polis is not just one of size, but is rather a difference in kind. The polis is a new kind of community because its good is no longer simply the sum of the individual interests of its members. Instead, it possesses a common good. Ironically, the individual citizen only reaches his full moral potential by placing the common good above his own interests. This may be most obvious in the case of a soldier, but in fact all citizens, as citizens, are able to reach this new moral horizon upon which their full happiness as human beings depends. To live a fully human life is to live as a citizen, which is why Aristotle boldly states, somewhat rhetorically, that a person incapable of participating in civic life, or who doesn't need civic life, seems to be something either lesser or greater than a human being, either a beast or a god. To say that political society is natural to human beings is not exactly to say that it comes naturally. Justice, like all of the virtues, is a habit and requires the necessary habituation, just as temperance and courage do. Justice is natural in the sense that human beings can only be fulfilled within the context of political society. We don't serve the common good instinctually, but we require training, parental education, and above all, laws that guide us in the service of the common good. So important is the role of law in accomplishing this, that Aristotle and Aquinas call the virtue of justice, by which we serve the common good, by the name of legal justice. And yet, justice has other dimensions as well. Aquinas says that we should think of it this way. If legal justice has to do with what the individual owes the community as a whole, we may also speak of commutative justice, which is what individuals owe one another. The simplest example of this is just buying and selling. If I buy an automobile worth $20,000, commutative justice requires me to pay $20,000 to the seller, just as it requires the seller to give me the car once I've paid. This is different from a third form of justice, namely distributive justice, which has to do with what the community as a whole owes the individual. The community as a whole may owe the individual certain rights, protections, even honors. In fact, as a matter of distributive justice, the community might owe an individual a certain amount of punishment for a crime committed, and in accordance with that person's just deserts. In the end, though, all three forms of justice, legal justice, commutative justice, and distributive justice, are only possible and really only make sense within the context of a polis, the highest and most authoritative natural community to which the human being belongs. Now, as we've seen, the virtue of justice is facilitated in citizens by the creation and enforcement of laws. To be sure, the role of natural law in the development of this virtue is essential. As Aquinas teaches, echoing Aristotle, the inclination to live and contribute to a political society is a prompting of nature itself, and all human beings have the general inclination to be just citizens of a political community to which they belong. But this can only be done, Aquinas recognizes, within the context of an actual political regime with actual laws. For this reason, Aquinas makes the distinction between the natural law and human laws. The laws, that is, made and enforced by human beings. Human laws are necessary for a variety of reasons. First, the natural law is not always enough to compel obedience. Some human beings, in spite of a natural inclination to the virtue of justice, choose injustice instead. As Aquinas explains, quote, "Since some are found to be so depraved and prone to vice, and not easily amenable to words, it was necessary for such to be restrained from evil by force and fear, in order that at least they might desist from evil doing, and leave others in peace, and that they themselves, by being habituated in this way, might be brought to do willingly what hitherto they did from fear, and thus become virtuous." End of quote. And yet, even in an imaginary world in which everyone was virtuous, Aquinas argues, there would still be need for human laws. For example, granted that everyone desires to travel on the roads in an orderly fashion, someone must still decide what side of the road people will drive on. It doesn't really matter which side that is, so long as everyone adheres to the same rule. This brings up an important point made by Aquinas. All human laws, he says, are based on and derived from the natural law. But not all human laws are so derived in the same way. First, there are what he calls conclusions from the general principles of justice already contained in the natural law. So, human laws prohibit things like murder, theft, and assault, things that go against the natural law and should be prohibited in every polis, in every legal system. On the other hand, there are many other laws, like the law determining which side of the road we drive on, that could go either way. And these Aquinas calls determinations from the natural law. They are still based on the natural law. They are just, one might say, further removed. How we ought to think of this is greatly helped by a brilliant analogy that Aquinas uses. The ways in which human laws are based on the natural law is like an architect making decisions about a house that is to be built. So there are certain things that any house must have given the nature and purpose of a house: a roof, a foundation, some way to get in and out, etc. Just as there are certain things about a political regime that must be in place, these essential aspects of a house must be there. On the other hand, there are a great many things that can be decided either way, either arbitrarily, like what color to paint the house, or according to changeable and contingent circumstances, like what materials to use for the roof, how big the house should be, and what kind of foundation to have, and many other things. Likewise, a political regime must rely on prudent judgments to decide what sort of government to establish, which specific punishments to assign for specific crimes, how elections are to be conducted, and countless other things. Again, this doesn't mean that all such decisions are arbitrary, like which side of the road to drive on. Just as you would never build a house with 3-foot ceilings, you would not establish a regime in which murder was punished with a mere $20 fine. To do so would go against the very nature of what punishment is for in the first place: to deter crime and to render the criminal his just deserts. But just as all aspects of a house are based on the general form of what a house essentially is, so also all human laws are, or ought to be, based on the natural law, and even derive their authority, not from their human lawgivers, but from the natural law. It's for this reason that Aquinas, citing Augustine before him, declared that unjust human laws, that is, laws that contravene the natural law, are in fact not really laws at all, but are rather mere acts of violence. Interestingly, it was precisely to this principle that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. appealed when he was asked to explain why he, a Christian pastor, resisted the segregation laws of the American South. He replied, quote, "The answer is found in the fact that there are 2 types of laws. There are just laws and there are unjust laws. I would agree with St. Augustine that an unjust law is no law at all." Now, what is the difference between the two? How does one determine when a law is just or unjust? A just law is a man-made code that squares with the moral law, or the law of God. An unjust law is a code that is out of harmony with the moral law. To put it in the terms of St. Thomas Aquinas, an unjust law is a human law that is not rooted in the eternal and natural law. End of quote. Perhaps the best illustration of the way in which the natural law lies at the center of human law, the virtue of justice, and the shared political life of human beings, is the question of the kind of regimes humans tend to form. Aquinas follows Aristotle in teaching that there are essentially 6 kinds of regimes, based upon 2 fundamental criteria. So first, we can recognize that all regimes are ruled in one fashion or another, either by one person, by a few people, or by the many. Likewise, we can broadly categorize those same regimes into those that are ruled justly, that is to say, for the common good, and those that are ruled unjustly, that is to say, for the sake of the ruler or rulers alone. As Aristotle teaches, the just regimes are called monarchy or kingship when ruled by a single person. They're called an aristocracy when ruled by the few, and a polity when ruled by the many. Alternatively, the unjust regimes are called a tyranny when ruled by one person, an oligarchy when ruled by the few, and a democracy when ruled by the many. So the difference between an aristocrat and an oligarch is that the oligarch rules for the sake of the oligarch, whereas the aristocrat rules for the sake of the common good. Neither Aristotle nor Aquinas seem to have strong opinions about which of the 3 just regimes is the best. In an absolute sense, Aquinas states that monarchy seems to be the best, since it's the one that most closely imitates the manner in which God rules his creation. At other times, however, he seems to favor a mixed regime that has elements of all 3. This is, for instance, how he characterized the government of the Jewish people under Moses. What appears clear, though, is that different kinds of rule may be more or less needed under different historical, political, international, or economic circumstances. What does not change, though, is that all regimes are required by the natural law to rule justly, that is, for the sake of the common good. This is why, for instance, that neither Aristotle nor Aquinas disparagingly refer to the single unjust ruler, the tyrant, as a dictator, since this term merely implies some kind of autocrat that refuses to share political power and rules without legitimacy. From the Thomistic and Aristotelian perspective, the degree to which power is shared is not really the decisive issue, nor is there any emphasis upon political legitimacy. What matters far more than legitimacy or the sharing of power is justice, whether the ruler or rulers rule for the common good or for their own good. If they rule for the common good and are effective in doing so, the form of government, though not unimportant, is secondary. And so the word justice embraces a great many things. As Aquinas argues, its orientation to the common good makes it the highest or noblest of all the moral virtues. Considered as such, it may be seen as a kind of crowning virtue upon the edifice of natural law, which lies at the core of the entire Thomistic understanding of morality. To be sure, that understanding is challenged by many competing theories of morality advanced today. And so for the next few lectures, we will consider some of the most prevailing modern approaches to moral philosophy, so as to compare them with the Thomistic worldview seen thus far.